Hey, how's it going everybody? It's your boy, and in these trying times, especially in my personal life, as some of you may know, I've had some family issues that need to be addressed. I still have had time to think about things, and in particular, I've been thinking a lot about generations. You know what kind of generations I mean. Boomers, Gen Xers, silent generation, millennials, Zoomers, that kind of thing. I've been thinking a lot about that stuff recently, because a long time ago, it must be at least a year or two, maybe even 4 years ago, something like that, I made a video about millennials, my generation, and about how disappointed I was. I felt in the video that my generation was not reaching our potential. I was very disappointed in some of the cultural aspects of our generation, that we were losing sight of certain traditions and freedoms, and instead we're looking for security and to take away rights, and that we were too busy using the internet for the wrong purposes, because we are the first generation to be brought up entirely on the internet, at least those of us in the West anyway. And I kept thinking that we should be creating more liberty, more freedom than less of it, that we were enslaving ourselves and others. But of course, really, although I wasn't wrong, it was more the fault of previous generations, because the millennials and the Zoomers, the older ones anyway, they wouldn't be who they are if it wasn't for the older generation. Now, of course, that becomes less and less relevant as the millennials age and become their own people, but by and large, we are the products of the previous generation's upbringing. And as I've reflected on that, I've begun to realise that millennials and Zoomers are more victims than they are perpetrators of a lot of the stuff that's been going on in the culture war. I've begun to realise that really we shouldn't be judging Zoomers and even millennials at this early stage in their lives, because you've got to remember the older millennials are only just beginning to reach their 40s. Some of them have not reached it yet at all. Most of us are not middle-aged, and even Zoomers, most of them have not reached their 20s, let alone reached 30. So it's really important that we remember that these are two very young generations. They've not really had a chance to taste power, to be in leadership positions that actually make an impact on the world. You get some people who are supervisors in a shop. I'm talking about people who are in positions of power who have to make decisions that will make life-changing consequences for people. I'm talking about prime ministers, even people below them in the cabinet. I'm talking about generals, field marshals, even CEOs, especially of the bigger corporations. They can make decisions that are life-changing for people. And to be honest, although there are some people who are in politics, who are millennials, who may be MPs, they may be reps, they may be CEOs of companies, but they're a minority. Most of the people who are in charge right now are the younger boomers and the Gen Xers. Even the younger Gen Xers are now in power. For example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, she is, I think, nearly 40 now. So she's very young for a world leader. I think she is the youngest who isn't a monarch, I think. Currently, it is mostly Gen Xers, mostly younger boomers and mid-tier boomers who are running the world. And I was thinking, really, we can't judge a generation truly until they've been entrusted with power, until they've been allowed to exercise power, and we get to see what they do with it. How do they enact change? Because millennials and Zoomers are still growing as people. Yes, even the older millennials have not really settled into what we can say is, for sure, the millennial mindset. Like how we can say, there's the boomer mindset, there's the Gen X mindset, as exemplified by this certain criteria. We can't really say for sure yet exactly what that will be. Just like we can't say for certain what legacy us millennials will leave behind when we grow old and wither away and die. We just don't know yet. Our legacy has not been created. We've not had a chance to. So I feel like in my video I was prematurely judging my own generation, because again, we're doing things right now as a generation. We're doing things, but the legacy, the consequences of those actions are yet to truly be felt by ourselves and by Zoomers and whoever the next generation will be called. We really do not know. And then of course there's the decisions we'll make when we're in charge, when we're in the position that Gen X are in and what the boomers are currently retiring from. And we can say for sure that the boomers messed up. They took what was given to them by the older silent generation types, the greatest generation, and well, let's just say they messed up economically on that front, and potentially have messed up Western civilization culturally and socially for a very long time now by embracing or in the conservative boomers' cases, allowing the postmodernist to enter in and deconstruct and subvert Western civilization. As for Generation X, well, they're still exercising their power. We are still seeing them make decisions, and as we can see, most of the world leaders, I would say, are mostly Generation X at this time. I think some of the decisions that they're making are not very good, and I think they will have long-lasting impact on us for the rest of our lives. I mean, again, the lockdown currently going on, a lot of the decisions made during the previous decade, I think we will be seeing a lot of repercussions for a long time now. Whether or not they will be judged as the right decisions or the wrong decisions, will Generation X be perceived as a better generation than the boomers? I don't know. I do know that certain people in my generation, I think Lou Levine may have said this, think that the Generation X, they're a generation known for really being lazy and not doing anything of note. That's the generation of Nirvana and keeping it real, things like that. You know, in the 90s, nothing really was going on, but again, you got to remember, in the 90s, they were still in their 20s and 30s, so they weren't really in the position to make change, to do anything. The boomers were brought up in a very particular cultural situation where people their age could make a cultural impact, could make a political impact at a lot earlier age, mainly because people were brought up at an earlier age. I think at the moment it's too early to judge the Millennials and Zoomers and decide this is what this generation is by and large, because one, the Zoomers are still growing as people. In fact, they're still growing up. A lot of them are not yet adults, they are not of age. Whereas the Millennials, we are of age, all of us, but we're still growing. A lot of us are still just entered our 20s, a lot of us have still entered our 30s, some of us are beginning to enter our 40s. There is still a lot of personal growth and ideological change that will go on for the Millennials, because you've got to remember, as generations age, they become more conservative, things change about them. So again, we've not entered that era of our lives yet. Some of us will be. Some of us have changed politically as a result of the culture war. I myself are one of potentially millions of millennial British people that have become, I guess, red-pilled as a result of certain cultural events. I hear a lot of people, specifically Generation X types, who think that they're dead manly, that millennial men are just completely worthless as men. You know, we're emasculated, most of us are girly, and no woman would ever date us. But as somebody who works in retail, somebody who has worked jobs where I have to deal with a lot of people, I would say that most millennial men are no different than any other generation of men. Sure, there are differences, obviously, because of age and, you know, certain practices. Again, all generations have similarities, but there are also the differences that mark them out as boomers and Generation Xers and millennials. But by and large, I think most millennial men are no different in the masculinity department. It's just that the internet has accentuated and allowed us to see more of what the hipstery SJW soy boy types are like. Now, don't get me wrong, there are more soy boys in my generation, and probably even in the Zoomer generations, than there are in Gen X and the boomers, but that's simply because we were brought up by boomers and Generation Xers. Millennials will have parents that are either both boomers or both Generation X, or in my case, a younger boomer and an older Generation Xer, or whatever. It doesn't matter what kind of combination it is. Or in rare cases, your mother, if she was a teen mum, could be the same generation as you. Zoomers, though, by and large, were brought up by Gen X, maybe some boomers, and some older millennials. And, well, as you can probably guess, they're bearing the fruits of this. A lot of Gen Xers and millennials were brought up via helicoptering and different standards of discipline, and we were brought up in a very leftist, feminist-dominated world where men were forcibly emasculated. Thankfully, though, I think most men weren't, because most people are not feminists. And depending on how old you are, where you live, what kind of school you went to, what class you are, I think that depends how emasculated and how masculine, I guess, you could be. Basically, it depends if you become a soy boy or not. I'm lucky that, as far as I'm aware, none of the schools I ever went to were infested with that kind of thing. Maybe it was, but they didn't seem to really impart it onto us. And when I went to uni in sixth form, I was by and large free from that stuff. SJW activism was more a bit on the side. It wasn't something that was in the classroom. But when I went to do my masters in the main university of my city, I went to the Polytechnic for my degree, it's very much part of the curriculum. So I guess it depends where you are, who you're brought up by, and things like that. Yes, there are more soy boys in the millennial generation than there are in the previous ones, but I would say this: they did not ask to be born, they did not ask to be brought up the way they were brought up. You have to blame the older generation. You have to blame those older Generation X types, those boomers, those leftists, for bringing them up wrong. And it's not their fault. Now, yes, of course, they made life choices, they made decisions and things like that that accentuated and made worse their soy boyness, but by and large, maybe they wouldn't have had the incentives to be like that if they weren't brought up by these people. But the thing is, there's always been soy boys. They just went through different names. There's always been emasculated types. There's always been people who didn't like how masculinity was or how femininity was and tried to change it. By and large, they didn't have the societal and cultural impact that they do now, and I think that's probably due to technology and the internet. So I guess really, in conclusion to this rather rambly video, is that I was too quick to judge. I think our time has not yet come. I think the Zoomers should not be right at the bat judged as this civilizational saving generation that are going to right the wrongs of the dastardly millennials who haven't actually created the situation that we're in. They were used to create the situation that we're in. We were the foot soldiers. We were not the ideological thought leaders. That was the older generations. Again, it's always the older ones who are the thought leaders, not the youth. It's too early to judge whether or not Zoomers are more conservative, are more red-pilled than millennials. From what I've seen, the differences are negligible. It depends on the subject. I always like to quote Pew Research Centre, which shows that depending on the subject, the difference is literally 1 or 2 points, if that. And what we've got to remember with Zoomers and millennials is that currently only the older Zoomers and the millennials of all ages are of age. And as a result, we're very similar. Again, compare a younger boomer to an older Generation X type. By and large, there isn't much of a difference between the two. That's why, for example, my parents could get together and still have a lot in common, because there was only a 7-year age difference. My dad was born 1960, my mum was born in 1967. Again, we're comparing not apples and oranges, but apples and pears. Let's wait until the whole generation of Generation Z have actually grown up, and then we can see how different the generations are, because then we'll begin to see differences. We will see the older generation of millennials begin to mature and blossom, and we'll see what the zeitgeist is amongst my generation and what our traits are and things like that, because it's not just soy boys, it's not just emasculation and things like that, it's not just social justice and authoritarianism, things like that. It's more than that. What it is, I can't tell you, because I'm in a very particular subset of millennials. Am I the majority? No. I don't know. We'll find out what the differences are between Zoomers and millennials once we're all grown up, and when we start seeing how ideologically, culturally, etc. we change. Who knows, maybe we'll always be very similar. Maybe we'll return to an era where generations by and large aren't really that much different from each other, and will continue to be so until maybe the next massive cultural change. Because you have to remember, before the older silent generation types and the boomers, by and large, there wasn't much of a difference between the generations. I mean, yeah, there always is clashes between old and young, but until the 1950s with rock and roll and things like that, there wasn't this massive difference, and then the 60s just accentuated it. Maybe we'll return to people being, by and large, very similar. Who knows? I don't know. But what I will say is that the millennials have not reached their full potential yet. We will begin to see that in the 2020s, 2030s and 40s for sure, and then maybe by the 2050s we'll be in power. The Zoomers definitely have not. They've not even begun to really develop as a generation. So, again, it's too early to tell. I think we can start judging Gen X and we can start judging the boomers, and we can say that they haven't done a particularly good job at the moment. Have Gen X done a better job than the boomers? Well, we'll have to wait till they retire. But currently it's not looking good for them, but they have time to improve. So yeah, I was mostly wrong in that video. I actually was too harsh on my own generation. I think that, again, we have parts to blame for ourselves, but again, we're products of our environment and also by our upbringing. And I think, again, we're still in a position where we can change ourselves. We're not completely set in our ways, whereas the others are. So yeah, that's all I have for today, guys. So I'll see you later.